So entertainment kind of moves right into the idea of black thought. So black thought, I'm terming this idea of people thinking about and doing different things to kind of create something new. So an idea of like writers. So on this first slide, you'll see people like Claude McKay. Claude McKay was a poet. We're going to look at some of Claude McKay's poetry as well as a couple other people's poetry and just kind of come up with potentially some of our own poetry as well. So Claude McKay here, he writes the very first book that was published during the Harlem Renaissance called Harlem Shadows. You can see here Zora Neale Hurston, who was a novelist. She writes short stories and she also writes folklorists and anthropology. One of her most famous books is called Their Eyes Are Watching God. Dorothy West, she wrote the book The Living is Easy, which is a novel. She also wrote short stories as well. And finally, here at the bottom, Edric Walron wrote a book called Tropic Death. Edric Walron was Caribbean, and he talks about life living in the Caribbean and experiencing the colonialism of people that other people come from other places to oppress you, like Britain, but also having a connection with those people because of the fact that you may live under their guise and information. A lot of minority people, Latinos as well, has similar ideas where they understand the idea of tropic death. Next up, we have Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes is probably the most famous of numerous of all these different people during the Harlem Renaissance. He was a poet, social activist, novelist, playwright, columnist, meaning he just wrote for the newspaper as well. He wrote poems, fiction, nonfiction, plays, and children's books. One of the most interesting things that a lot of people kind of really don't know about Langston Hughes was that he was actually gay. It was interesting because during that time period, not a lot of people would want others to know that they're gay because of the fact that they were ostracized by that idea. At the bottom, you have Count Tay Cullen, who is a poet. If you go to Harlem, the library is actually named after Count Cullen. James Weldon Johnson was a member of Mr. Winston's fraternity, Phi Beta Sigma Fraternity Incorporated, but he was also an author, an educator, lawyer, diplomat, songwriter, and civil rights activist. He worked with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, that we're going to talk about a little bit later. Very first black person to be a professor at NYU, New York University. James Weldon Johnson wrote a very famous song with his brother called Lift Every Voice and Sing, which actually turned the black national anthem. Jean Toomer, in the top right-hand corner, was an American poet and novelist. And finally, we have Alice Dunbar Nelson. Alice Dunbar Nelson was a poet, journalist, and political activist. She really, really wrote about some important factors that was going on in everyday life. So she talked about the idea of people lynching others, and she was against it. She talked about women's suffrage. Much of Alice Dunbar's writing was rejected because she wrote too much about the color line, oppression, and themes of racism. If you write about it too much, we're not going to put you out here. That's exactly what happened to Alice Dunbar. More writers, because writing was one of the biggest things that happened during that time period. We know this guy. His name is Carter G. Woodson. You're also going to see that he was one of the very first scholars to study African American history. He was the founder of the Journal of Negro History in 1915. Woodson was cited as the father of Black history, and in February 1926, he launched a celebration of Negro History Week. It was the precursor, like I said before, to Black History Month. There's also going to be another person that you're going to see here, Joel A. Rogers. J.A. Rogers was actually one of a really big author during that time that really tried to get people to connect back to their roots. A lot of people now, if you talk to Dr. Sneed about him, you promise you have a 10, 15, 30, 60-minute conversation. If you say, who's J.A. Rogers? He was a Jamaican author, journalist, and historian. He challenged prevailing ideas about race, demonstrated the connections between civilization and traced back African achievements. So this man was trying to make sure that people knew where they came from and understood that it was important for these people to do powerful things. Finally, we also have Eugene Gordon. He was a journalist, editor, fiction writer, and social activist. This last slide here for writers, we have two people. Neil Larson. Neil Larson was working as a nurse and librarian. She published two novels. In 1928, she wrote this book called Quicksand, trying to figure out how people navigate the world when they're half black, half white. In 1929, she actually wrote another book called Passing, where there's two friends. Um, both of these friends are they're like half black, half white. One decides to live a life as a white woman, the other one decides to live a life as a black woman. Um, so these two friends, they meet one day and they just kind of like figure it out. Like, how is it that you kind of like, what experiences do you have because you're passing as a white woman? What experience do you have because you're passing as a black woman? Um, she also wrote a lot of short stories, but she really looked into the issues of racial identity and sexual identity as she went along. Finally, we have Zelaine Leroy Locke. Um, he was considered the dean of the Harlem Renaissance, like the person that just kind of like led and kind of got people and organized and in order. He was a little bit older, but he did write this book called The New Negro, which was the idea was based on self confidence and political awareness, how people can kind of just be better people because of the Harlem Renaissance. Strangely enough, he was also gay. He's also a member of Miss Winston's fraternity, Phi Beta Sigma Fraternity Incorporated.